our website. You may need to click the blue continue button to proceed with being recorded. So now I'll introduce our speakers. Dr. Erin Carnes is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama. Her areas of expertise include how media depict terrorism and counterterrorism and the influence this has on public perceptions, community police relations, particularly in counterterrorism, strategic communication decisions among groups that use terrorism, and factors that increase support for violent and non-violent political action. And we have Dr. Joseph Young, a professor at American University, whose interests relate to cross-national causes and consequences of political violence. He's published numerous peer-reviewed articles across academic disciplines, even winning one award from START for one of those publications, including political science, economics, criminology, and international studies. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Carnes. Take it away.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, thanks so much. I think Joe's actually going to start the first part.
No problem. Joe, please start.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. I want to first thank kind of START generally, because START has been so unbelievably supportive of both Professor Carnes and myself in our early research. We both were started with START as researchers, as graduate students. And Gary and Bill and Jessica and all the people at START are unbelievable, and we're just grateful to be here. So thank you.
Thank you guys, and we love to have this people coming back and forth, going out in the world doing great things, and then returning the goodness to START. Thank you.
And we're grateful. So this is a little picture of our book, as you can see from Columbia University Press, Tortured Logic. Why some Americans support the use of torture and counterterrorism. Okay, we can go to the next slide, which Professor Carnes and I started this idea thinking about how TV and media shows like 24 affect people's views on public policies. And for those of you who've seen the show 24, I'll give you just, you know what's going on, but for folks who haven't seen it, the basic idea is you have this federal agent, Jack Bauer, who's got to solve some big crime problem that is some terrorist organization or terrorist group is going to do something awful, and he's got to get to the bottom of it and stop it. And as you can see in this picture, he's interrogating a potential suspect. I'm guessing, based on the blood, that there's some type of torture that's been involved in the interrogation. And Professor Carnes and I had read a statement from a General Finnegan that said, was worried about this show because he felt it was having detrimental effects on folks in the field, on troops in the field in Afghanistan and Iraq, and was giving them ideas about how to interrogate. And so he went to the producers actually in Hollywood of 24 and said, hey, you need to be careful about what you're doing and how you're thinking about it. We think it's having a bad effect. So the basic problem that motivated the book and motivates this talk is sort of related to this question. And we're going to just deal with that problem and then kind of explain why you should care. And then we're going to explain what we already know about the problem and discuss our argument and then how we go about testing it. And then we'll conclude with implications for academic research, but also for policy implications for those of you who are on this call who are more in the policy world. So one of the big problems is that many in the public think torture can be an acceptable tool in counterterrorism, as we just showed you in that little vignette about 24. But when we look at because we also talk to a lot of experts in the field, when we talk to experts in the field, they all think that they all don't believe that this is that evidence and expert opinion says that torture isn't effective. And so we have the public thinking it can work, and yet experts saying it isn't effective. And so the puzzle that we come up with is, given this consensus, in the expert world, why do some people end up supporting torture and under what conditions, and why do some people not support torture? And so we're going to be investigating this kind of question about support for torture using a bunch of different experiments. So the first one, going back to what we were talking about with 24, is thinking about does does something like 24 actually affect policy? Are we just doing something that's kind of fun and maybe a little silly? And the chair of the screenwriting program at UCLA, Richard Walter, said in a conference in 2008 that said, look, these things that we see on TV, they're pretend, they're not affecting public policy. But then on the other hand, we have a Supreme Court justice like Antonin Scalia, who's now passed away. He explained at a conference in 2007 that Jack Bauer, the protagonist in 24, he saved Los Angeles. And in other public comments, he made claims that we should be doing things like Jack Bauer. And then we have experts in the field, like the one shown here, who was a former interrogator at Abu Ghraib, who also wrote a book on this topic, who claims that we see specific instances where people take ideas from TV shows like 24 and they do these electrocutions and mock executions, and they play them out in real life. But his biggest claim, and this is also what got us interested, is that what we really get from television is the idea that torture works, and that's a big part of it. So we're just going to do a very quick history, a long history of torture in the U.S., and it's going to be kind of condensed. If we could probably spend the whole topic just discussing the torture over our history, but we'll take a few key events. And one key event is, at the founding of our republic, George Washington, our first president and a military officer, made it very clear, and you can read this, I won't read this whole comment, but he makes it very clear that this is not a practice that U.S. Soldiers should be doing when dealing with enemy soldiers. And so starting with Washington, there was a real prohibition to having that behavior with enemy soldiers. But of course, there was plenty of torture in the U.S., and especially of Native Americans and black slaves. It was quite common. But unlike what we showed at the top, where that torture was about trying to elicit some kind of information, most of the torture that we saw of Native populations and of slaves was more about punishment or deterrence, and not necessarily eliciting some type of information. So it's pretty different, and it's a different context, but it's important to sort of make it clear that the U.S. is not absolved from torture. And much of this torture of slave populations especially was more of the physical or scarring type, just to differentiate it from what we often talk about as torture light. And part of the reason for scarring, slaves is to sort of show they were being reticent and they needed to be punished, and to potentially, if they ran away, it could be clear who's a slave. But also that this torture could be psychological. That was definitely a possibility. And as we outline in the book, there was an instance where a slave was not following his master's dictates, and so the master sold the slave's family over to a different plantation, and he never saw his family again. And that was not an uncommon, what we would call a torture technique, but more of a psychological one. And if we fast forward to World War II, vast majority of torture that was committed in this Grand War was committed by Germans, Japanese, and the Axis powers. The Japanese in particular mass tortured POWs for actionable information against the US specifically. There's anecdotal evidence that it backfired. Whether it did or not, that's not entirely clear. But part of the world's experience with torture from the Germans and the Japanese led to all kinds of rules about how we would do this. Now, there was kind of a general lack of interest, I would argue, by the US public about torture from this post-World War II era all the way up until 9/11. And partially, I think there was this unspoken consensus between the US and its allies that the US wouldn't do the nasty stuff, maybe the CIA occasionally, but the goal was to kind of outsource some of this behavior to our allies in Latin America and let's say the South Vietnamese government. And so, we had a School of Americas where we trained foreign military, and we taught them some of these techniques, but generally we tried to keep our hands a little bit cleaner of being involved in that. So then we get up to 9/11, and then this concept of enhanced interrogation becomes extremely powerful, and becomes something that we debate nationally. And as you can see, there's a little slide of the enhanced interrogation techniques that were approved by the Justice Department and in the Bush administration. And we started to have debates about whether this was an appropriate tool to use in counterterrorism. And the Abu Ghraib scandal came out, and then that led to a large public debate, and then ultimately a Senate report about torture and whether we should be doing it, and techniques that were unacceptable and acceptable. And of course, we've had presidential candidates and ultimately the president who are arguing in favor of some of these enhanced interrogation techniques and even explicitly using torture in counterterrorism. Now, our interest is really in trying to figure out how people's views on torture change. And so, what one thing that we found is that there are two types of people in this, and that one is fixed in their beliefs, and it's really hard to change their belief on torture. And then there are some whose beliefs are more fluid. And what we want to try and figure out is, among those fluid types, how do they change and when do they change, and what factors are going to lead to their change? And our kind of main argument is that people are inclined to respond to violence with retaliatory violence, and in a setting where the U.S. is attacked by a horrific violent terrorist attack, it's expected that there would be a lot of support for using violence as a retaliatory response, and that might be largely supported by the public. But we also found that support for those violent actions can be constrained in lots of predictable ways, and we can actually sway people away from it and towards it by varying some important factors. So, to talk about a couple of things about that we know about support for torture. We know that the perceptions of torture are being swayed in certain ways, and this little political cartoon is a nice example of these different ways that people can be persuaded on who it's okay to be tortured, who it's okay to torture. One thing that affects people's opinion on whether torture is acceptable is often the suspect's identity. So obviously, if the suspect is from a racial or ethnic group or religious group that is connected in some way to terrorism, that's seen as more acceptable. Obviously, also, if the perceived guilt of the subject is the subject is seen as for sure guilty, then people are a lot more supportive of torturing them. And then whether the torture occurs within the U.S. or outside of the U.S., it's not surprising that we've had torture events in Guantanamo Bay and in Abu Ghraib, in places outside of the U.S., kind of far from, there's messy business that Americans get involved with, just it's not okay to do it at home. And then the last factor is the type of torture being used that I alluded to before. We have this kind of scarring type of torture that most people assume, electrocutions and whippings and those sorts of things. But there's plenty of non-scarring or torture-light techniques that are used, like sleep deprivation and forced standing and these other types of actions. And people tend to be more supportive of those torture-light, even though sometimes those torture-light can be more painful for someone and ultimately have bigger impacts on them later in their lives. So we build on prior research in this, and we're going to show you 4 experimental studies. We might whip through a few of them just in interest of time and to get more questions from you. But we also do these experimental studies, but we also do a series of interviews with former interrogators and professionals who work in this space and understand counterterrorism and can let us know whether these are effective or efficient techniques. So the first experiment that we'll talk about relates to media and perceptions of torture and terrorism, and goes back to the first things that we talked about related to the 24 show. So again, as we talked about before, there are plenty of folks who say that torture in media, it's just entertainment, it has no influence on views or policies, it's just fun. But then there are others, like we saw before, that include a number of interrogation experts who say, no, shows like 24 are having a detrimental effect, and people are learning techniques from them, and they're taking this view that torture is an effective tool. And so we need to think about the media that we're displaying. And Professor Carnes also has a paper that is really clever and looks at torture in kids shows. And maybe not surprising to some of you, but it's pretty surprising to me and to others, is that we have shows like Zootopia, you know, a kids movie that has white instances of torture. And so if torture is affecting people's views on things and we're giving it to them at young ages, it could be pretty detrimental. So what we want to figure out is which one of these things it is. And this is another quote from the same interrogator, where, you know, he said he saw with his own eyes that people were taking ideas for harsh interrogations from TV shows. And they would watch these shows and then they would sort of act these out in an interrogation booth. Okay. So just to give you a brief overview of the experimental process, this is like a flow graph to kind of show it. And then I'll pass it over to Professor Carnes. What we did in the experimental process is we lied to people a little bit. It wasn't a bad lie, where we said, you're going to do a little current event study for us. And we gave them 5 topics that we were going to ask them about: torture, global warming, gun control, intelligent design, and marijuana legalization. And we said, okay, how much do you support those things? And then we gave them 5 video clips. And the video clips on the control conditions like global warming, gun control, intelligent design, et cetera, those were all the same for everybody. And then we randomly assigned people into 3 different conditions. One condition being they see a clip from 24, and in that clip from 24, we see torture is really effective. It elicits the information that Jack Bauer wants it to do, and he's able to stop a horrible terrorist attack. And then we give them that exact same clip, but we cut it short, and we end with a little vignette that says this torture was totally ineffective and was not able to elicit the information that Bauer was looking for. And so, you know, that was clear that it was the same clip and it was 24, but it was ineffective. And then the third clip that we randomly assigned people to was that it was an interrogation with Jack Bauer, but there was no physical contact, there was no torture, it was just an interrogation. So then we did a post-test where we asked folks again about their support for these 5 current event topics, and so we could compare beliefs pre and post-test based on just their random assignment to those different conditions. And then we also, to get beyond just their beliefs, we asked them to sign a petition in favor or in opposition to enhanced interrogation as a way to see whether this media actually affected someone's their behavior, not just their viewpoints.
All right. And looking at the results from this study, we can see is that people who saw torture as being effective were significantly more likely to say they supported torture post-test. What's interesting here is that while General Finnegan, who had originally put forth this idea that 24 might have an impact on troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, had said that we need to show torture not working because that will decrease support. What we found here is that's not the case. Seeing torture, even if it doesn't work, it did not significantly increase support for torture, but it certainly didn't decrease it either. And in the control condition, on average, it had no impact on people's views of torture, which is suggesting to us that perhaps showing torture is influencing views. We then looked at the petitions that participants were given both in support of and in opposition to the use of enhanced interrogation. And what we're seeing here is that people in both of the conditions that saw torture, the one where it worked and the one where it didn't work, were significantly more likely to take action by signing a petition. That's not necessarily a petition in support of torture, it's in opposition to torture as well, but seeing torture perhaps made the issue more salient and made people more interested and willing in taking action about the issue. So some of the takeaways from this first study is that when people see torture work, they're more supportive of it. When people see torture fail, it does not lower their support for the practice. And people who saw torture were more likely to take action regardless of whether or not it worked. And again, this idea that Professor Young had mentioned about fixed versus fluid views, about 75% of this sample didn't change their views from pre-test to post-test, while about a quarter did, which is something that we'll return back to in each of the subsequent chapters. So out of this first study, there were some other questions that we had about, about how media influences people's views of torture. And this came from both some of our original presentations about this and questions that audience members brought up, as well as us spending more time just thinking about this. So we see that 24 can influence people's attitudes and behaviors. And these media depictions can push people to support the practice. But a question that remains here, and something that Colonel Kleinman, one of the people who we interviewed for this book, brought up, is that we need to have TV shows that show this really thoughtful interrogation, and that's more effective, and why other approaches don't work. This leads to a question that we have as a follow-up, which is, can we show rapport building interrogations? So what Colonel Kleinman and the other experts that we spoke with say is actually more effective. If we show people scenes with rapport building interrogations in counterterrorism, can that reduce their support for torture? So the experimental design here is that we had a total of 7 video clips. So similar video clips, actually the same video clips as the study that we just talked about. We added one other sort of condition here, is where we have condition where it is clear that the torture did not work, because there's a bomb that blows up at the end. And then another condition where it's a little bit more ambiguous. We don't see the torture working, but we also don't see the outcome of that, for fear that perhaps not seeing sort of a bomb explode might have made people not understand whether or not torture had worked. We also have 2 clips of rapport building. This was not something that was frequently depicted in 24, or depicted at all from what we could tell. But we did take a clip from the television show Criminal Minds, where Mandy Patinkin, so another middle-aged white actor, is the interrogator. He is interrogating a suspect who is speaking Arabic, making reference to the Quran, much like the clip that we had taken from 24. So these are pretty analogous to one another. We have a clip where the rapport building approach was effective and they got the information, stopped the attack, and a clip where the rapport building approach was not effective and the attack still was carried out. Another potential explanation that we might have had for our results showing that torture as ineffective did not decrease support is that we were just priming people to violence in general. That when people see aggression at all, they're primed to respond with with aggression in response. So we included a condition that has nothing to do with terrorism or counterterrorism, nothing to do with torture. It's just a depiction of 2 guys in a fist fight to see if we might just be priming people on violence in general. We collected data 2 years ago with a national sample of almost 1,800 people. And these are our first results. So if we look here at the first couple of bars, this is replicating what we'd found before. When people see torture work, they're more supportive of it. When people see torture either not working or ambiguous, it doesn't influence their support for the practice. A couple of the things, though, that really surprised us is that when people see a general clip of violence, it decreases their support for torture, which is sort of the opposite of what we had sort of expected. We theorize this might be because people are more able to sort of empathize with getting hit in the face, because most of us have been at least accidentally hit in the face with something, whereas people have a harder time empathizing with a terrorism suspect because that's not something we could see ourselves ever sort of experiencing. So the 2 that really confused us was the rapport building, whether it works or not, makes people more supportive of torture. And our first inclination was, well, we must have miscoded something. And we went back about a dozen times, and this is not the case. But we see that when people see rapport building working, it makes them, or not working, it makes them more supportive of torture. And our guess here is that people have just been so conditioned to thinking that we need to be, harsh with terrorism suspects, that this is viewed as perhaps being too nice. So a couple of the takeaways here is, again, seeing torture work makes people more supportive of it. These media depictions of counterterrorism interrogations can push people to support torture, but don't pull people away from supporting torture. And this general violence has a different impact than specific violence. So this is not about just a violent response itself, but something about terrorism specifically and torture specifically. Again, we see that about 3/4 of the participants in this study did not change their views of torture pre to post test, while about 1/4 again did. This brings us then to the third experiment that we did, where we're looking at some of these factors both of the event itself, as well as how salient torture is in a public space and how that influences whether people define an interrogation as being torture or not. So sometimes people care more about torture than others. We saw this in the first study when people who saw torture, from whether it worked or not, were more likely to sign petitions. There's something about that issue being salient in your mind that makes you care about it more. So we have three factors that we thought in the experiment might explain whether or not people define an attack as being torture. The ethnicity of both the interrogator and the suspect, whether this event took place domestically here in the US or far away in Afghanistan, and whether the type of torture used was psychological torture or physical torture. What also happens sort of in the process of collecting data from this is that, and we collected data originally from this in the summer of 2014. This is a decade after the Abu Ghraib scandal, and torture had largely fallen from public discussion. It's not something that was being reported in media. It's not something that people were really, in the broader public were really thinking or talking about. In late 2014, the Senate Torture Report was released, which then for at least a brief period of time made torture sort of a salient topic in public discourse again, which allowed us to do a natural experiment within an experiment, meaning that we were able to collect data both before the Senate Torture Report was released, so when the issue is not salient, and then again right after the Senate Torture Report was released, where this is a more salient topic in the public mind. So the experimental conditions, as I said, are the interrogator and suspect race, which we paired into dyads of Caucasian or Middle Eastern, which were instantiated with the names using very common sort of white American sounding names, and then very common Muslim male names. The location being the US or Afghanistan, and then whether the interrogation involved no harm, physical torture, or psychological torture. The two questions that we're going to be presenting today are whether people defined that interrogation as being torture. We asked a bunch of other questions about the incident as well, and that's all reported in the book, and the findings are largely fairly similar, so we're just keeping it short for today's sake. And then we also asked people whether they would be willing to sign a petition on torture, again, just like we did in the first study. We have two samples here. So 1,200 or so people in mid-June of 2014, another 1,200 or so people participated in mid-December of 2014, right after the Senate Torture Report was released. What we see here is that both pre and post release of the Senate Torture Reports, the pre-report is the black dots, post-report is the gray diamonds. The ethnicity of the interrogator and the suspect doesn't really matter for whether or not people are defining the interrogation as torture. People were more likely to define the interrogation as torture when it occurred in the US as opposed to Afghanistan, and were significantly more likely to refer to it as torture if it was both either psychological or physical harm as opposed to no harm. But when we compare from pre-Senate Torture Report to post, the issue salience isn't really having much of an impact on how people view the interrogation itself. Where it did have an impact, though, is on whether people were willing to sign a petition in support of or in opposition to torture, much like we saw in the first experiment, where people were more sort of aware of and thinking about torture outside of the context of this study. They were more likely to take action as well. So some of the takeaways from this chapter is that these social similarities impact views of an interrogation in some cases, but not others. The type of harm does impact views of whether an interrogation is torture or not. Salience only impacts the actions, not the beliefs themselves from the study. And again, like we saw in the other two chapters, about 3/4 of people have a fixed view and about 1/4 of people have a fluid view of torture. This brings us then to the last of our experiments, where we're looking at elite opinions. So taking, like Justice Scalia and other elites and who have spoken about 24 and torture, how that might impact views of torture, support for torture, along with other elements of the suspect's identity and the likely outcomes if you were to use torture in terms of whether it would be effective or not. Joe Navarro, retired FBI special agent who we interviewed for this project, and I'll let you guys read this, basically saying that, the people just don't want to listen, even to him, an FBI special agent who specialized in counterintelligence, who has conducted these interrogations. People don't even want to listen to him that torture doesn't work. And this is kind of getting at this crux of how can we shift people's views away from this impact that media might have had to form the views that people have on torture. So here we're looking at why people are more supportive of torture in some situations than others, and what might be able to influence that. So the elite cues, group-based preferences. So we're looking at this two ways, both the nationality of the suspect and the ideology of the sort of the group, of why they were suspected of, or that they were suspected of perpetrating terrorism in the name of in the first place, as well as how effective or ineffective we would expect torture to be. So here we used what's called a conjoint experiment. And what this type of experiment does is that it's able to randomly assign multiple different sort of vignettes or factors independently, so that we can give the same participant a number of different scenarios to evaluate without contaminating their views from study to study. So this is something like where, say, if Apple's going to create a new phone, they want to find out what's the best combination that most people are going to buy. They might randomize the screen size, the screen color, and the memory, and ask you to choose, which one of these two do you prefer? And then how likely are you to buy option A? How likely are you to buy option B? It's the same idea here, except for that we're varying factors and asking people about which scenario they'd be more likely to support torture in, and how likely they actually are to support torture in each of these scenarios. So perhaps a bit more sinister. These are all of the potential factors that a person could see. Who the expert is, so military interrogator, academic researchers like Professor Young and I, member of the Supreme Court, member of Congress, either Republican or Democrat, so priming on partisanship, or a friend, someone who you know and trust but is not seemingly an expert in this. Varying citizenship between the US, so someone who's in our in-group, UK citizen, so somebody who is similar to us but not quite our in-group, a Syrian citizen, so foreign and, at least in the public discourse, associated with terrorism, or a Chinese citizen, so foreign but not associated with terrorism. We have 6 different potential goals of the suspect and 3 different potential outcomes, so either accurate, mixed information, or inaccurate. This we collected data with a national sample of a little over 1,100 US adults. Because each person evaluated 10 total incidents, this really increases the number of observations that we have. And what we're interested in is how supportive people were of torture in each of these incidents. Gone through that a little bit already, so I'm just going to skip through that in the interest of time. This is the summary results. So if we look at the different sources, people were more supportive, more trusting in a military expert relative to the other sources. But this sort of runs counter to things like what a couple actually the experts that we spoke with said, where they're like, yeah, I mean, I can occasionally convince someone that I know what I'm talking about, but it takes a lot of time, which is sort of frustrating to think about how do we shift public view. In terms of the suspect's nationality, people were more supportive of torture against a Syrian suspect. In terms of the goal, you can see this breaks down. People were most supportive of torture against a suspected member of ISIS or an armed militia as compared to the other groups here. And then people were, of course, more supportive of torture if they thought it was going to be fully effective or partially effective. So the takeaways from this final chapter, this final experiment, is that the perceived efficacy of torture really matters for how supportive people are or aren't of it. Some in-groups, like ideology, matter more than others, like nationality. The elite cues didn't have much of an influence on people's views of torture. And again, some people's views were fixed while others were fluid, but here it was flipped. And what's important to note here is that because every participant answered about their level of support for 10 total incidents, we can look at not just between people, between you and me, but how am I internally consistent or not with my views, and show that most people have some sort of, within their own views, have some sort of flexibility. Even people who said they would never support torture or they never think it's effective could occasionally be a little bit more supportive in certain situations. And I will turn it back over to Professor Young now.
Well, thank you. Those are exciting experiments, but just to give you some concluding thoughts that relate to kind of both academic research and policy implications. So as we said, we have sort of partial support from these experiments for our main argument that people support torture kind of for these retaliatory reasons. Obviously, any academic work is just one little piece of the bigger story, and we hope that there's more studies that are done that probe these mechanisms and can refine what we find and offer some new arguments. And we think this is about a larger issue. It isn't just about finding out how people support torture or not. It's about how do we persuade people, and how do we persuade, we could take a huge public policy issue, let's say like wearing masks, and how do we persuade people that they need to wear masks, and who's going to be able to be changed or not changed. So these are all sort of related to, I think, our core question. And we find efficacy, identity, and location all influence our support for torture. Well, some of the other factors that have shown up in other studies largely don't. And so there needs to be, I think, a little bit more replication of these results to make sure that we can sort of rule out some factors and really say that, the things that, we're confident that efficacy, identity, and location matter, but to be confident that these others don't, maybe needs to be some more work. And as Professor Carnes and I have both said, is there's this predictable subset of the population that can be swayed on torture, and then predictable subset that can't. And that's, like I said at the top, that could be on all kinds of public policy matters, but I think it's useful. It's definitely useful for policy folks to understand, because then they can know who to target to actually change opinions. And in our study, anyways, the folks that tended to shift the most were either racial minorities or Republicans. They had the most fluid views. Now, that could be for a number of reasons, and maybe this changes depending on the context. But one of the things that we think is going on in places where you have either low interest in a topic or low information on a topic, that's where you're going to have a more ability to shift an opinion on it. But where you have a lot of expertise in something, or a lot about something, it's harder to shift your opinion on it. So one of the things that Colonel Kleiman told us that was really, I think, useful to understand is that the pro-torture people have a pretty simple narrative, and it's an easy narrative. It's sometimes we need information quickly, and we have to do nasty, dirty things to get that information to keep America safe. And because torture works, sometimes we have to sort of bend our morality a bit. And then ultimately, if it doesn't, they deserved it anyways. And it's a more complicated, as you've been sitting here for the last 40 minutes or so, understand, it's more complicated to tell the story about why you wouldn't torture. And it's not as clean in a narrative. And so that's a tough thing to sell. But we think that to narrow some of this gap between expert and public opinion, that we have to change the narrative on torture. And one way to do that is to limit these depictions in entertainment media. As I said before, we shouldn't be glorifying torture in kids' movies, for example. Now, in a free and open democracy, we can't tell Hollywood not to do those things. We can't say stop doing this, or we'll sanction you or something. But I think we can encourage them that this is detrimental to developing unhealthy views on torture, and doing that through better public awareness and education on how depictions of torture affect people's viewpoints. And we talk a little bit more in the book, but there's a lot of evidence coming from psychology even early on in the Bobo doll experiments, which were done on kids back in the 50s and 60s, to show how showing kids how to do something violent kind of helps predict future violent behavior. And so we think if we can get a little bit better public awareness and education here, we can probably reduce some of this support for torture. But also, ultimately too, we have multiple samples. We obviously worked on college students, but we also have nationally representative samples of Americans to look at whose decisions are swayed or not. But we'd also like to see the people who are making these actual decisions, if they are swayed as much by these entertainment media. And we had talked to the military and several other groups about doing some experiments there, and we haven't gotten too far with that. So, but we would be interested in doing it if we can get into the right situation. So thank you so much for being here, and we're looking forward to discussing your questions. There's our emails too, if you want to follow up with either of us. I think that Jessica's going to be taking questions from the Q&A. Is that right?
Yep, you are right. Thank you so much, Joe and Aaron. Very informative talk. I'll jump right into the questions. Let me just pull them up. First up, are you noticing that people who don't support torture are more likely to have a higher theory of mind? That's the ability to understand that others have beliefs or desires different from one's own than those who do not support torture.
So it's an interesting question. It's not something that we specifically measure just because we had sort of the time confines of how long, how many questions we can ask people in a survey before they just get bored and give up. Theoretically, I could think that that probably would be the case, but I mean, it's ultimately an empirical question. And as Professor Young said, there's still so much in this area of research that we just don't fully know and understand. Trying to measure that in a future study, I think would be super worthwhile.
Yeah, and some other START researchers have investigated how people go through this process of violence to become, terrorists. And I mean, this is different, but it's similar to going through a process where you're acceptant of violence and you would, accept that other people are doing violence on your behalf. And certainly one of the conclusions from that is people who are able to think more complexly in terms of seeing lots of gray in behavior are less generally supportive of doing violent things than people who are much more, sometimes they use this term Manichean, like black and white in their thinking, tend to be more supportive of violence and ultimately lead to violence. But as Professor Carnes was saying, we didn't actually ask this question, but I think it's a good one, and I think I would expect that we might find something that is consistent with what the questioner is asking.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense of the extent to whether people had ticking time bomb scenarios in mind when indicating whether they'd support torture? So we need to get this information fast to disrupt a plot that's about to go off. How does that context impact one's support?
So great question. I mean, in the TV clips that we showed, it was a ticking time bomb scenario where, either Jack Bauer or I can't remember what Mandy Patinkin's character's name on Criminal Minds was. They have to get the information because there is an attack that's going to take place in the next 6 hours or something to that effect. So it is this ticking time bomb scenario. We didn't specifically ask that in the last experiment because it was just sort of here's just torture in this scenario, this interrogation period. It wasn't clear that it was this ticking time bomb situation. There's certainly, there's been public opinion polls, that people tend to associate torture with these ticking time bomb scenarios and don't think about it in the context that it actually takes place in the real world, where a ticking time bomb scenario is rare, if ever, actually occurring.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question because it does matter, and so we in some of the experiments we just told them it's a ticking time bomb scenario, right? But if we left that ambiguous or sort of took people out of that, I think that would have a difference. I guess part of the argument here is that since most of the media that we looked at, it sort of presents that ticking time bomb scenario, partially because it's more dramatic and interesting. That's sort of what got us thinking about it.
That makes sense. How do you believe these trends in public opinion affect decision makers and foreign policy, if at all?
Yeah, okay, so public opinion is such an interesting sort of question here. And there are, survey companies that have asked about public support for torture over the last 20 years or so. And they tend to typically find it's about half of the public supports torture, but there's variance in how the questions are worded. Often it's a presumption that torture works. I'm not really clear on how much this impacts the actual policymakers, the public opinion part. I mean, there's certainly reason to think that, when there is more public backlash, either torture ceases or at least ceases from being as sort of publicly sort of out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's something that is a little bit beyond our expertise in terms of, you know, the folks who look at this link between public opinion and then policy outcomes. I mean, that was part of the motivation for wanting to do some experiments on people who actually implement these policies or people who actually make these policies, because then we can get a tighter connection. We don't have to worry that there's something about, you know, you vote for somebody who does a policy. Instead, you're someone who does the policy, and how does the media affect you? So that's a way that we think we can kind of circumvent that a little bit. I mean, in basic democratic theory, right, we expect that, you know, most of the time our elected officials are sort of doing our bidding or our will. Of course, we know from our practical lives that's not exactly what happens, and so that's something that troubles us too. And the way that we have thought best about trying to circumvent it is getting right at that target population.
All right, I'm going to lump 3 experiment survey questions into one. First of all, regarding the third experiment, were the individuals of the samples the same for the first wave and the second one? And then, do you see a significant difference between the survey of college students as opposed to the wider national sample? And then the third is, were there any narratives that people said were explicitly dissuading them from supporting terrorism?
You want to take one of those, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Let me see if I can remember what the first one.
Sorry.
Or I can take the first one.
Yeah.
The first one is no, is the answer. But I mean, from statistical theory, we wouldn't need the same people, because we randomly selected people from the first one and randomly selected people from the second one. But what we can tell is like differences between groups. What we can't say is whether individuals actually change their mind from the salience, which, you know, is a limitation. And I think in a perfect world, and it's really just a question of money, to get those exact same respondents is super expensive. And so if we could have, though, in my estimation, maybe that would have resolved the kind of limited findings we find there. I think we would have seen changes, but that's my take on it.
And then the second part is the difference between the survey of college students versus the wider national sample.
Yeah, so we actually didn't look at the pre-test support for torture between the college students and the wider sample. My hunch is that college students were probably on average a little bit less supportive, but we were really interested more in the experimental results. So how much change was there pre-test to post-test? And those results replicated, were the same between the college sample and the national sample. And then the last question about any narratives that explicitly dissuaded people from supporting torture, I don't think really, no.
Well, the sort of minor version, I think, is, I can't remember who made this claim, but it was one of the people we spoke to said, you know, like at a dinner party, if I say I'm a torture expert and an interrogator, and I really think it doesn't work, and here's the reason why it doesn't work, and sort of walks people through it, it might have sort of effects at the margin. But like I said, that's a way more complicated story and way more specific story than, hey, torture works, and if it doesn't, you know, well, that person deserved it anyways. Like, that's a way easier story, right? And so that, I think, that difference explains why why, as Professor Carnes notes, we're able to really push people to go and support torture, but it's harder for us to pull them away from it.
Another experiment question. Did you measure the population's education level? If so, there's interest to learn how much one's education level impacted or influenced their answers.
Sure. So we did measure education level in each of the studies. Again, we were more interested in the impact that the experimental treatments had, where there, because of random assignment to the different conditions, the average education level in each condition should be about the same. So we weren't really looking specifically at education level and its impact on support for torture pre-test. I mean, I can probably take some vague guesses as to what that might be. I think people who have a higher level education would be less supportive of torture by virtue of, you know, perhaps, you know, more developed critical thinking. But we didn't look at that specifically, no thanks.
Yeah, although the only other thing to add to that is that, again, if they had more information or more news consumption, that might affect it as well.
Yeah.
Because again, in these spaces where you have, you know, if I asked all of you, all 50 of you, what your opinions were about abortion, I'm sure every single one of you has an opinion about that. But if I asked you about, nuclear deterrence with North Korea, maybe I don't get as many opinion responses because we know less about that than we all have an opinion about abortion. So I think torture is more in one of these spaces closer to where we have low information, and so it's just less kind of fixed viewpoints.
Great, thank you. Should we take torture off the table and let the person who's being interrogated know that it's off the table? Tough one.
I actually think this might be the easiest question for me personally. I mean, yes, it's a violation of human rights. There's no real evidence that it's effective. There's evidence that it's counterproductive. If the goal is to actually gain actionable intelligence, if the goal is to punish, which there's some experimental evidence that people like to say they support torture for these, it's going to get information, it's going to make us more safe reasons. But when you actually drill down, it's because they think that the person deserves it and they want to punish them. There's no evidence though that torture works for its stated goal of gathering information. So I would say yes.
So I think there's a mild disagreement among us on this. Again, our book is not about the morality of torture. That's not necessarily the point of it. But I don't think it's wise to ever state a policy with your adversary about what you will or won't do. Now, I would take off the table that will actually do it, but I wouldn't tell Al-Qaeda, we won't torture you. I would just simply say, I would instruct our interrogators, that's not something we do. Now, if Al-Qaeda wants to tell their personnel that, oh, by the way, you may get tortured if you get into U.S. Custody, I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I would just say as a policy from the U.S. government, we shouldn't do it.
Great. We have about 5 minutes left, so send any last minute questions in. But I have a pretty good, I feel like, wrap up one. What is your sense of what people believe torture is intended to accomplish? And in other words, you show that people often support people, but what do most people think torture actually does? Does it give important information? Does it teach terrorists a lesson? What else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And one that I think I kind of alluded to a moment ago is that, I mean, people say that they think torture, yes, it gets information. Maybe they'll also say that it's punishing and it's okay because the person deserves it. But that these ideas largely seem to be coming from the media representations of torture and not from sort of how this actually looks.
Yeah, so I would agree that I think most people think it's effective at gathering information in these ticking time bomb scenarios, and that it can be effective at deterrence and punishment. But I'd also add that I think, and this is maybe part of the American can-do spirit, where we're attacked after 9/11 on 9/11, and after 9/11 there's this feeling we have to do something. We can't just sit on our hands. And so when you're saying, hey, we've got these detainees and they're not giving us information, then there's this goal of do something, whatever it is. I don't care, it just needs to get done. And I think that do something mentality also is a reason why we keep seeing it happening.
Do you think that do something mentality is sort of worn off? I mean, it's been 19 years since 9/11. Do you think that sense is kind of dissipating?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think definitely attention towards terrorism and counterterrorism are low right now compared to the way they were even 5, 10 years ago. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. These things, ebb and flow. For good reasons, a lot of the country is interested in issues related to racial justice and pandemics and climate change, and pick the horrible thing that's going on right now. And I understand that. But people have been tortured in police custody, and we've had other sorts of actions internationally where this behavior continues to go on. So this isn't going to go away, and I think we still need to be thinking about it. But I understand also this need to prioritize other kind of more salient things right now.
Thank you. Erin, I know you are hitting a time wall here. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to offer?
I just thank you so much for coming and listening to us talk a little bit about the book. We've spent 8 years or so working on this, so it's nice to finally be out in the world, even under these sort of odd circumstances for a talk. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for joining us. Seeing no more questions, I'll go ahead and end the event now, but let you know that a link to this will be posted on our events page. There will also be a recording of this talk. And thank you so much. Please check out our future events, and Joe and Aaron, stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Much.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.